Desde Dakar, Senegal, nos acompaña Stephanie Sainz, quien nos hablará sobre la forma en la que se puede crear un sistema para mejorar la inclusión de género en la industria minera y su experiencia aplicando esta metodología en otros países del mundo.
Okay, thank you. That is such a hard act to follow. But I'd like to wish you all a good morning. And if you bear with me, I'll give you a moment to put on your translation as you needed it. Okay, so let's change rhythms a little bit. And I'd like you to close your eyes. Okay? If you still see me, your eyes are not closed. This makes it much easier for me to speak. No. Okay, so what we're going to do is pretend that we've never visited a mine, okay? And now you're invited to tour the top 10 mines of the world. What do you see? What's different about mining? What cultural element do all the mining, at least the responsible ones, share? As we know, you can open your eyes. Mining companies have an obsession with a 6-letter word called safety, okay? You get to your mine site, there's signage everywhere. Everyone does safety training, not just new hires, but all levels of the organization, okay? And even as a visitor, you've just gone through several induction trainings. And maybe you've even been invited to contribute a safety share, because even as a temporary visitor in a community on mining, you have something to offer. Okay. But some of you, we won't say who, some of you may remember that it wasn't always this way. As recently as 20 years ago, the accident and fatalities in mining were the worst, amongst the worst across industries. Accidents and even deaths were common occurrences, and this was considered unfortunate, but by many, a just normal cost of doing business. Many industry veterans at the time insisted that things could not be different, okay? That it would be impossible to change the status quo. So what changed? Quite simply, the leaders and the shareholders of the top mining companies, the largest mining companies, said that things would have to change, that the poor safety record of the industry was no longer acceptable. For example, in 2007, a new CEO of Anglo American actually shut down the largest platinum mine in the world for about 7 weeks. It was highly unpopular, very controversial. Some of the quotes said, "She's crazy," but she did it anyway, okay? They shut down the mine until the protocols, the safety procedures were completely overhauled. And when Anglo American showed that the risk of mining could be reduced, industry changed. So now, if you actually read your agenda, you may have been expecting a conversation on gender, and you may be wondering if you're still in the right place. It's okay, you are. Look at the picture. All right. Now, what does safety have to do with mining in Colombia? For me, the safety culture of mining shows that this industry has a track record of making the unimaginable possible. With the example of safety, we have in recent history a case of an entirely new culture for mining being created, and it was not created by chance. Okay, oops, that was before. All right, so my name is Stephanie Sines. I'm a senior sustainability specialist with the International Finance Corporation. IFC, a member of the World Bank Group, is the largest global development institution focused on the private sector. And I feel so strongly about this topic that I traveled by plane 24 hours from Dakar, Senegal, to join you here today. In the next 20 minutes, I want to take you on a journey to show you what it takes to get results on gender in mining. The key point is this: gender inclusion will not happen by chance. Like safety and everything else in mining, it will happen through systems and the cycle of continuous improvement. Now, this kind of sounds daunting. It won't be easy, but we know it's possible because with our collective culture of safety, mining companies from Mongolia to Senegal, Canada to South Africa, and all the way here to Colombia have shown that mines around the world adopted an industrial level culture, regardless of the context that they operated in. Okay, so now, you are very busy people, okay? With safety, the benefits were clear. You may be asking, why should mining companies care about being gender inclusive? Okay, so here's the secret. A gender-inclusive workplace is not just better for female employees. It's actually better for all employees, for communities, and for the bottom line. Okay, are you ready to travel again? This time, let's picture a cold breeze. We're gonna go back in time to visit an oil company as it announces it intends to recruit more women, okay, to work in its industry, but also in particular on offshore rigs. The company's plans meet mixed results, okay? At the time, women aren't working at all in offshore rigs. Many people, including and especially the company's employees, are saying it's too dangerous for women. It's not family friendly. You know, the conditions are too harsh, the hours are too long, and it's completely incompatible with family life. The company listens, and actually, they agree. They say all those things are true. But they're not only true for potential future employees, female employees. The current work environment is hard and difficult for everyone. And that's the problem here. Not women working on oil rigs. So the decision to become a gender-inclusive workforce became an opportunity for the entire company to overhaul its work environment and practices, particularly for the offshore work. Now, facilities on rigs were improved, more shore leave was granted, and employer-provided childcare and other policies supportive of family life were rolled out. Safety standards were strengthened, staff were trained, protection against unacceptable behavior were put in place, and the company invested in career development for its employees. After several years, staff were surveyed. What did they think? And actually, most of the original employees said that the changes were overwhelmingly positive. They reported less aggression, more collaboration, less bad language, and fewer mental health issues. They also reported greater happiness and purpose in their jobs. They spent more time with their families, a higher quality of life, and a stronger likelihood of staying with the company for the long term. Recently, on a project that I work on in Africa, when we spoke about managing family life when working on a remote site, are you really surprised to learn that fathers also wanted to spend some time with their newborns? That actually men also reported that some of the sexually charged language used by their colleagues was creating a hostile work environment for them. As we consider the future, and much of the buzz these days is how to attract people to mining, we need to be thinking how to create a more attractive industry for both men and women. Okay, so gender inclusion is good for employees, but how about for company performance? Let's take a look at work with communities. In a World Bank study on gender-sensitive approaches in Peru's extractive industry, a representative from an international organization said, "Now, it is true that in most cases, women are not directly involved in decision-making." Okay, but it was also true that men, after negotiations with the mining companies, often left, came back after reaching an agreement, and took back what they said after thinking about it. Because, why do you think? Because when they went home to think about it, there were some other opinions that were shared, and they had to go back, explain that they had not made the right decision, and the company had to restart negotiations. Now, if women's opinions had been brought in early on, perhaps time and money and effort could have been spared, and also the discussions more productive because the engagement with women would have been direct. Okay, let me grab a glass of water here. So, speaking of women's contribution, companies do better in general when everyone can speak up. Harvard Business Review found that managers who listen to and act on women's ideas enable a speak-up culture that capitalizes on women's creativity. Okay. Leaders who are willing to change direction based on women's input are more than twice as likely to tap into winning ideas. And leaders who make sure that each female member on the team gets constructive and supportive feedback are 128% more likely to elicit breakthrough ideas. In today's fast-changing world, ideas are currency, and this is critical. And in general, and more studies over the last 10 years, the statistics show that companies that are gender inclusive deliver real, measurable improvements in business performance. Okay, let's do a recap, check in to see where we're at. We've agreed that gender inclusion is a cultural change that would require a system to support it. We've agreed that mining companies are good at implementing systems. And we've agreed that gender inclusion can have worthwhile results from a business perspective. But that's all fine and good. The question we're hearing more and more is, how do we do this? What should companies be doing? Okay, here we go. IFC is about to launch a new toolkit. It's for gender and infrastructure, including mining, and it's called Engineering Inclusivity. This is not our first toolkit. The first toolkit was launched by 5 years ago, but since then, we've had a lot of learnings, practical experiences, and so we decided it was time for an update. The toolkit in the coming weeks should be available online. It will be free, and it has 64 practical tools that not only explain how to increase gender inclusion in the workforce, but also how to increase inclusion in your supply chains and in your work with communities, as well as how to address gender-based violence and sexual harassment across the company footprint. We know change requires a system, but what are the components of this system? Let's take a walk through how to establish your baseline and know where you're starting from and how to apply the plan, do, check, and act process to start your company's gender journey. So first, you need to know where you stand today. Okay, right now, in terms of gender inclusivity. The first step is to assess your company. The IFC toolkit includes all kinds of assessment tools that are designed to equip companies to carry out this type of diagnostic for workforce, supply chain, and community work. We have checklists for the type of data you need to collect, terms of reference to help you hire experts when necessary. For example, if you want to do a deep dive and examine, as a case, pay gap analysis, as well as other practical guidance. Now, collecting this baseline information is important because it allows you to benchmark your company against others, identify your strengths and weaknesses, and eventually to monitor progress. Let me ask you a question. Who knows where your company stands today? The ILO reports that in the overall labor force in Colombia, women account for about 44%. In mining, the figure is only 13%. For the industry globally, women constitute between 8 and 17% of the workforce, which puts Colombian companies right in the middle of the average. So, is your company leading or falling behind the pack? What was interesting when I was working on a project in Africa with a mining company that began collecting data, the data revealed something different from what actually everyone in the company thought. Women in the company were actually doing quite well once they were hired. They had good rates of promotion and retention, but the challenge was that initial recruitment was slow. So this was a real learning for the company, because that was not what people commonly thought. When looking at policies and practices, it's important to ask, are there ways that how we do business today are excluding some employees or potential future employees? So, for example, we actually know from studies that women typically apply for jobs when they meet 100% of the job criteria. Our male colleagues seem to go for it when they hit about 60%. So, are we taking a better look at our criteria? Could we be changing them to encourage more applicants? Or sometimes number of years can exclude women from opportunities from time that they took off for childcare, even though they have the necessary skills and experience. Finally, as we consider how we're doing and doing an assessment, it's really important to think about bringing in employees to help evaluate how you're doing. They're the most important part of this process. We've been using a tool that is now in the new toolkit called an employee scorecard, and it's an opportunity to to facilitate a conversation in a way that's non-conflictual, that brings men and women, different levels of the organization, into a conversation to first decide what they think is important in a gender-inclusive workforce, but then come together and collectively agree on priorities. So that management employees have a dialogue, men and women are part of the conversation, and people can choose where people should be focused. And this leads us into the next stage, where we're looking at planning. This is critical. Once you have an idea of your strengths and weaknesses, you may be tempted to tackle all of the issues at once. It can be really exciting to have this knowledge because oftentimes a lot was unknown. This is a pivotal moment. A key learning that we have is that actually companies should not try to do it all. So while I said we require this huge system-wide cultural change, it's okay to start small. In this era, when the word greenwashing has become so important, we know that credibility counts. It can also be very demotivating if you promise big and then find out that it's taking longer and it's harder to deliver than you thought. So one thing that can be helpful in setting a critical path is developing a gender action plan that links your different initiatives together, but also connects what you're doing on gender to existing plans. The idea is not to reinvent the wheel completely, but to leverage the systems and procedures that you already have in place. So maybe it's connecting some of your gender actions to your safety objectives. Maybe it's linking things to a supplier development plan or your stakeholder engagement plan. And of course, basing these findings on the findings of your assessment. Now, because you can take lots of different paths, that means what you end up doing can vary. So what your company is doing can be different from what your company is doing. That's okay. For example, you may decide as a company that your responsibility first is to consider duty of care for your current employees. So you may want to look at safety and ensure that the workplace infrastructure that you have has the necessary adaptations to enable women to work safely alongside men. This can be something about your physical environment, lighting, security. It can also be appropriate PPE. You could also be thinking about improving the culture around respectful workplace and creating a company free from harassment and bullying. This is an area, however, we suggest you bring in a trained expert because it can be a really challenging topic to tackle. However, when successful, it can have a huge effect on employee morale. One thing that we did recently is undertake a listening exercise with a company, because really, on this topic, listening to your employees is key. But to do it in a way where the employees felt safe, we did a double-blind study. And that meant that both the company and IFC, who are helping develop this study for their company, were unaware of who was interviewed. That was actually confidential and only known by the consultants that did the study. This enabled employees to freely share what they thought about the company's current culture, and it really revealed a few things. First, what was happening, but also that there were persistent perceptions about things the company thought they had addressed, but actually had not communicated as well as they had thought. So it's not just reality, but also perception that matters. After an in-depth review such as this, you would want to follow by establishing clear codes of conduct with defined disciplinary responses, proportionate, though, with the impact of the actions, as well as communications, training, and support to prevent and respond to any incidences of workplace harassment or bullying. You could also choose a different path. I actually specialized in local content development in Guinea. That was my first 9 years with IFC. And IFC has recently launched Sourcing to Equal here in Colombia. So if you wanted to start with supply chains, there might be a little bit of inspiration there. Initially piloted in Kenya, Colombia is the second country where IFC is implementing this 2-year program to advance gender-inclusive sourcing in Colombia. The idea is to increase the number of women-owned businesses in companies' supplier bases. So far, there are 15 participating companies, including one mining company. The program includes a few things. The idea is that the companies make a commitment to IFC about how they're going to make sourcing more inclusive, and then a platform is created in which these companies can share their ideas, their learnings, their results, their losses, and then have one-on-one exchanges with IFC to update on progress against their commitments. And finally, there's work with suppliers on developing capacity. So some potential commitments could include collecting disaggregated data on women-owned or led SMEs so that they can establish a baseline, which we said was so important, and track progress. There's also conducting public communications on the diversification of the supply chain, so potential suppliers are aware that they are encouraged to respond to tenders, or there are platforms to promote procurement opportunities that are transparent and accessible so that women, often left out of word-of-mouth networking, can hear about opportunities. This is another case. Transparency is typically good for the mining on procurement. Or perhaps you'd like to start on the community stream. One approach that we've found to be effective is to develop community programs that, while not exclusively focused on women, are inclusive and have explicit objectives related to gender. This can help with community acceptance of women's participation in the programs. So for example, in Peru, a mining area was trying to diversify the sources of income in the communities for households and was developed, which included a component that targeted women. The idea was that women would be taught to grow crops required to improve the malnutrition rates in the area, with the objective of both selling their product at market and keeping produce for households. So now we've assessed, we've planned, and we've done. It's time to check and act. So since during the planning phase, you set a clear indicator, have initiatives that have been implemented, you can check results and act accordingly. For example, when we checked on our agricultural program in Peru, using a gender lens, we actually found something completely unexpected. The agricultural extension workers had become highly trusted members of their community, and women actually started to disclose incidents of domestic violence. We also found that the program workers actually didn't know what to do and were giving varied responses and were often not the responses that would have been informed by good practice. So acting on this learning, we developed a training in conjunction with the government to train program workers on how to respond and provide appropriate legal and medical referrals. This training program was eventually adopted by the Ministry of Social Inclusions to have on hand when others were doing similar programs. So you can see that some of the initiatives you're developing can actually be helpful for a much broader, large portion of the population. If we were to change continents, go now to North Africa, an infrastructure company has set ambitious targets to boost the participation of women. And instead of doing something on Excel, they actually created a very sophisticated data monitoring system to monitor its progress towards targets. The company set up indicators for hiring, retention, promotion, and HR performance. This enabled the managers to quickly identify that while they were achieving great success in hiring new female talent, they were also losing that talent in a few years' time when women left the workforce to have children and then chose not to return. This insight led the company to invest significantly in career support, childcare support, family-friendly workplace policies, and more generous leave allowances in order to boost the retention of its female staff. The company's systems allowed it to meet its targets, exceed its targets, and it's actually now on track to reach gender parity in revenue-generating roles by 2030. So, data collection, though, is not the only way to monitor results. You can find several other options in the IFC toolkit. For example, in another project that we worked on, we helped a company establish a gender task force. This actually creates an ongoing feedback loop between company management and its employees on how it's doing on gender inclusion. So we've talked about a lot of things. Maybe you're still with me. Hope you are. In order to be successful in this, we've said it's system-wide, it's cultural, so leadership really matters. It is critical to set the tone and signal company expectation. And for this to be successful, support really does need to come from the top, and not only from leadership on an individual mind, but from HQ, from corporate, head office, etc. Creating this systemic change can not only come from the top, though. Everyone needs to be brought in. If we go back again to the safety example, it gives us important clues about how to successfully change a culture. There must be a way to measure success, and there must be a strong incentive for change. Decision makers must also resource and empower their middle managers who will be carrying out most of the work of the day-to-day. And they also need to hold those managers accountable with clear agreement on how internal accountability for gender will be assessed. And milestones should be agreed. And finally, management needs to ensure that the selected actions, perhaps in your gender action plan, are followed up on. So, I am being honest. Gender inclusion is a system-wide change that does require significant investment of effort, resources, time, and creativity. But I hope what I've shared with you today might have helped to convince you that the results can be worthwhile, that you have the foundations to make the change, that there's actually a toolkit to help you do a roadmap, and finally, if you're still on the fence, you're not quite sure, may I suggest that you go home and think on it. For this is where the future of mining is going. Thank you very much.